Hi, everyone. This PowerPoint provides a brief overview of the administration of John F. Kennedy, one of the best remembered presidents in American history for a variety of reasons. Probably the main one, the tragedy surrounding his death, his assassination in November of 1963. Kennedy came from an extremely wealthy family, privileged upbringing. I talked about this in class. You can see on this slide a picture of him as a college student playing touch football. So, Ivy League education, went to elite boarding schools before that. Kennedy served in the Navy during World War II as captain of a PT boat, patrol torpedo boat, and his craft was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. Kennedy rescued a number of crewmen, and those exploits made him a war hero. There's a lot of publicity about this incident and helped launch Kennedy's political career. So, Kennedy first ran successfully for Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, and then made the jump to the Senate. Repeatedly in his political career, especially in the early years, Kennedy had the benefit of coming from a privileged background, having connections. His father helped him in numerous ways. Good example of this that I mentioned during the PowerPoint presentation to the class was Kennedy's best-selling book, Profiles in Courage. The idea was his for the book, which was to write a book about famous members of the U.S. Senate who had taken unpopular stances on some political issue that history subsequently proved to be the correct position. So Kennedy had this idea for a book, but then had back surgery, was out of commission for months, and his father hired a writer to basically do the entire book, even though it was published under Kennedy's name. That still happens today with people writing books for others and not receiving credit. Kennedy's case, as I mentioned in class, what I think was egregious is that this book won, and Kennedy accepted a Pulitzer Prize for it, the highest literary prize he can receive. So just one of the examples of the advantages, the benefits Kennedy enjoyed because of his background. Kennedy was not nearly as well known as Richard Nixon when he ran against Nixon in the 1960 presidential election. Nixon had come into Congress the same year as Kennedy, and like Kennedy, was a veteran. They both were elected to Congress in 1946, both made the jump then to the U.S. Senate, and then Nixon became Dwight Eisenhower's vice president and was one of our most activist and high visibility vice presidents, serving under Eisenhower in the 1950s. Kennedy projected himself as being younger, more energetic, full of ideas. He and Nixon were only 4 years apart. There wasn't a huge age difference between them. This picture is not from their first televised debate. The first one is the famous one where Nixon was ill. He had a high fever. He was sweating profusely. He had lost weight, looked terrible. Kennedy, in contrast, was tanned, debonair looking, well rested. Plus, this is in the era of black and white television. Kennedy wore a dark suit that contrasted with the background, whereas Nixon wore a gray suit that faded into the background. I mentioned to the class that polls taken of television viewers indicated that TV viewers overwhelmingly thought Kennedy won the debate. People who only listened on radio thought Nixon had the stronger performance. So this first debate was the one that received the highest television ratings. They did others, but it gave Kennedy much needed exposure, as Kennedy was the youngest presidential candidate in American history to that point, and the first Catholic elected president, as it turned out. We had had Catholics run for the presidency previously, but Kennedy was the first to be elected. And as Eric Foner mentioned in the book, and I did too, this is one of the closest presidential elections in American history, with Kennedy winning the popular vote by just 110,000. In fact, there were recounts going on that ran up almost to the inaugural ceremony itself. I mentioned to the class that one of the reasons for public fascination with the Kennedys was that Kennedy himself was handsome, intelligent, with a sharp wit, self-deprecating humor. He had a great deal of charm. People were fascinated with him. And also his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, who, as I mentioned to the class, frequently is discussed in terms of her redecorating the White House, but I explained that that was way beyond that description, in that she set up a commission to track down all sorts of historic objects that had once been in the White House that were in storage, or in some cases had been sold off to collectors. She was an extremely intelligent person, spoke fluent French, good writer, skilled photographer. And the Kennedy had young kids, which is the first time we'd had children in the White House in a long time. And so they fit the whole mentality of the baby boomer era. Like many American families, they had young children, and this contributed to fascination with them too. The print media provided the Kennedys a lot of favorable publicity. Life magazine, Time magazine, Newsweek, Look magazine, all of these publications carried splashy photos of the Kennedy family and really projected this image of two kind of, very engaged parents, engaged with their children. And here's the president, taking time out to romp with his kids in the Oval Office, sailing with his daughter, Caroline. Kennedy loved his children, but the Kennedy marriage was much more complicated and troubled than these pictures gave any hint. Kennedy was a serial adulterer, and this had been, a fact of their marriage pretty much from the beginning. And as I explained to the class, Kennedy's adultery didn't consist of relationships so much as just sexual encounters. I think it's probably impossible for a president in the modern era to get away with the behavior Kennedy did, because we would know about it. But different standards in this era, the few people who knew about Kennedy's behavior didn't say anything about it, didn't come to light until many years later. Kennedys held all sorts of cultural events at the White House. They really made the White House a cultural center for the United States. Presentations by musicians, artists, poetry readings, readings by novelists. So there was this sense of glamour, culture, sophistication, as I note on the slide, during the Kennedy presidency. And I showed the class this slide, this photograph, the Kennedys leaving the theater, and you can see all the people who have thronged down just to get a glimpse of them exiting. Jackie Kennedy's style choices influenced fashion of the era. So there was just an element of glamour that hadn't existed in the White House with the two previous presidents, especially Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman. So Kennedy had won by a narrow margin. They note on this slide the Democrats had just a slim majority in Congress, and conservative Southern Democrats were somewhat suspicious of Kennedy, and all of these things meant that he frequently had to compromise. And while the Kennedy administration had a lot of ideas for what Kennedy called the New Frontier, which would feature an array of domestic initiatives, policy initiatives and legislation, very little of that happened. A lot of discussion of things, but Kennedy felt like he didn't have much leverage when it came to initiating domestic policy. And frankly, Kennedy was much more interested in foreign policy and foreign affairs than he was domestic policy. Plus, he felt that he had a freer hand with foreign policy than he did domestic policy, and he would, throughout his presidency, focus much more on foreign policy than the domestic side. But a lot of these ideas, concepts, and plans from the Kennedy administration became the basis of the Great Society programs that Lyndon Johnson initiated and passed when he succeeded Kennedy as president. So I mentioned in the PowerPoint that I did for you during our Zoom session that Cuba was one of the focal points of Kennedy foreign policy early on. And this was because of a political revolution that happened in Cuba in 1959, where Fidel Castro, an army commander who was a socialist, came to power and overthrew a corrupt pro-American government run by a family, the Batista family, that had been in power in Cuba for a long time. The Kennedy administration, like the Eisenhower administration, was hostile to Castro. And in fact, Kennedy inherited a plan devised by the American Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, to overthrow Castro that involved landing 1,500 Cuban exiles in a remote part of the southern coast of Cuba, an area known as the Bay of Pigs. This is one of the most incredibly stupid plans ever initiated by anyone connected with the U.S. government. The idea that these 1,500 men with no air cover, no heavy artillery, no tanks, were somehow going to be landed in this remote spot and defeat Castro's armed forces, the Cuban Army and the Cuban Air Force, was just absurd. The original plan called for a larger force. Kennedy scaled it down. He had misgivings about this plan from the beginning, understandably so, and went along with it reluctantly. It was a complete failure. These guys never got beyond the beach. The ones who weren't killed were captured. Was hugely embarrassing, even though Kennedy gave a false story initially and denied American involvement. It was obvious to the world that the United States was behind this operation, and eventually Kennedy accepted responsibility for the operation, but it was a humiliation for the United States. On the other side, it increased Castro's apprehension that the United States would launch a full invasion to drive him from power. And so the Bay of Pigs had the unintended effect of prompting Castro and the Soviet Union to plan to place a deterrent in Cuba, which were medium-range missiles with nuclear capability that the Soviet Union began placing in Cuba in 1962, along with several thousand, tens of thousands actually, Soviet troops to man and operate these facilities and guard them along with Cuban forces. And this was discovered by American spy planes doing overflights of Cuba. And when the Kennedy administration found out about this, it launched an extended period of high-level, very tense discussions, with Kennedy being pressured by a number of military leaders to bomb these sites or invade Cuba outright. And so these discussions were going on for almost 2 weeks before Kennedy informed Congress and the public about what was happening. So this map shows you the range of these missiles. They had the capability of reaching a substantial part of the southeastern United States. And in the Cold War era, the presence of these missiles with nuclear capability